Hi, I'm Mike of SourdoughHome.com and BakeWithMike.com, and today we're going to go to the second day of making our sourdough starter. According to Professor Calvel and past experiments, it should take about 2.5 days. This is the second feeding. I kept the starter in our Broden Taylor proofer at 81 degrees. If you keep it at a lower temperature, it will take longer. How much longer? Good question. But to start today's process, we dump out the starter. The starter looks very much like it did yesterday. However, it feels softer, which tells me that something biological is going on inside. Now, I'm going to take a second and clean out this bowl. Okay. Now it's nice and clean. It probably isn't necessary to clean the bowl, but it looks better. What I'm going to do now is take 300 grams of the starter and feed it some more. Every time we add more flour and water to the starter, we call that feeding it. And the reason we call it feeding it is because, well, it's alive and flour is food. We need 300 grams of this starter. There we go. And I'm going to suggest you discard the rest of this. A lot of people don't like throwing away starter because food was used to make it. But at this point, it's not food. It's a biology experiment that hasn't run to completion. There's no telling what's growing in there at this point. As the starter becomes a mature starter, the starter kills off competing organisms and becomes safe. Right now, no guarantees. So we'll get rid of this. Okay, we're done with the scales. Everything else has been pre-measured. So let's put the starter in our bowl. I haven't measured how much this is, but I'm going to guess about 1.25 cups to a cup starter. To this we're going to add 180 grams of water, which is about 3/4 cup. Now, the starter is quite thick, as you know, so I'm going to suggest you mix it together before we add the flour. Many people don't like dealing with the starter that's so thick. They'll point out it's beginning to foam, which is again more indication that biological activity is taking place. By mixing the water and the starter together at this point, it'll be easier to add the flour and the other ingredients in a minute. Almost makes me want to get out our immersion blender and word the silly thing. Okay. That's as far as we're going. To that we're going to add 300 grams of all-purpose or bread flour, 2 grams of malt extract, 1 gram salt. On the malt extract, some people have asked what kind of malt extract, and you can use either diastatic or non-diastatic, whichever you have. If you don't have any in-house, which is not too uncommon, you might get diastatic. It has enzymes in it, diastatic enzymes that help break down the starch into sugars, which provides food for the yeast and the sourdough. Either will help, but the diastatic would be a little bit more helpful. Now we stir it all together. And again, we're going to probably wind up pouring this onto our work surface and kneading it because it's quite thick. As we add more white flour in the next few feedings, it'll become a lighter and lighter color as more and more of the rye flour leaves through the discard. We're going to let this rise covered for 7 hours till about 5 o'clock this afternoon, and then do it again, and then after the 5 o'clock feeding, it'll be another 7 hours and midnight when we do our next one. That's one of the things that I'm not crazy about with this approach is that sooner or later you're going to wind up with a feeding at some awful hour. The feedings don't have to be exactly on time, but I wouldn't suggest getting lazy and waiting until morning. So let's dump this out and knead it a bit. It's much more cohesive than it was yesterday. Okay. But again, we want to incorporate all of the flour into the starter. It's softer and stickier than it was yesterday, which is a good thing. With the starter My Way project, we would have looked at the starter to see if it was active and decided if we needed to feed it. One of the nice things about Professor Calvel's approach is there's no judgment calls. It's 22 hours later, feed it. It's 7 hours later, feed it again. Okay, I think it's not fully mixed, but it is good enough. So let's put it back in the container. And cover it with a nice Pyrex lid, or a shower cap, whatever you have. And it'll go back in the proofer until 5 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you.